in the cold hours before dawn, when candle flame trembled like a nervous heartbeat, and the great stones of the cathedral held their breath. The iron crown was neither legend nor relic. It was an object unfinished, a promise of power braided with a design meant to terrify. Its making began as a craft and hardened into a ritual. Metal and prayer were hammered together until the seam between sanctity and cruelty dissolved. Within this seam, kings sought the lie of immortality and instead found a slow, private annihilation. The chronicle begins not with coronation, but with the smith's hammer. The smith's forge sat beneath the cathedral, in a half-ruined crypt where the breath of the earth mingled with coal smoke. Here, the man known in records only as the smith bent to heat iron until it ran like a tired thought. He shaped the circlet by a commission cloaked in piety. The crown would bear the weight of a kingdom and the veneer of divine right. The smith's hands were broad and scarred, the skin suit, darkened and mapped with old burns. He worked with a practical fatalism, knowing that craft could offer a place in memory even if that place carried stain. The high priest moved through that same shadowed world with very different tools. He had the robe and the beaded rosary, the honeyed rasp of a voice that could turn counsel into command. Where the smith measured metal, the priest measured the reach of influence. He brought to the forge not flame, but an idea that sanctity could be used as leverage, that an object consecrated with ritual could bind a throne to the church's will. The high priest's face was gaunt, his eyes small and pale. He spoke with the practiced humility of one who understood how reverence could be converted to obedience. He wanted the crown to be both symbol and shackle. The wearer arrived later, as all monarchs do, wearing the hunger of unshaken entitlement. He was a veteran of years that had sharpened vanity into brittle cruelty. Weathered and stocky, he kept a tattered mantle about his shoulders, and an iron circlet lined with leather as a talisman. Devotion and arrogance braided together in his manner, a half-smile that never reached his steely grey eyes, habitual fingernail picking when doubt approached, and a touch to the crown as if the metal could assuage the small animal fear that waited at the base of his skull. He sought legitimacy through ritual, craving an absolute that might silence the rot of uncertainty. The chronicler watched and recorded. He moved with a quieter hunger, bent over ledger and quill, fingers stained with ink, eyes alert yet hollow. His work was to preserve truth, even the truth that corroded faith. His ledger would become the slow accumulation of detail that would later bind memory to consequence. He kept distance not because he was cold, but because to place himself too close would make him complicit in the stain. When the crown emerged from the smith's fire, it seemed modest at first, an iron band roughened by the blows that shaped it. A circlet threaded with a few shards of metal and bone. Yet the high priest found ways to add sanctity and terror together. He arranged relics into the crown's frame, stitched iron to leather with ritual knots steeped in prayer. He had the smith embed points of hardness, small spines driven inward along the inside rim, so that when set upon a skull the circlet would sit not as offering, but as instrument. The design was deliberate, an architecture of discipline that would convert faith into a slow sentence. To attend a coronation was to be wrapped in layers of expectation, chants muffled behind stone pillars, incense that softened eyes but sharpened the throat. The pallor of wax reflected in faces. The wearer stood beneath a vault painted with saints whose halos had weathered into faint circles. Courtiers breathed in the ritual as if it were air. The high priest spoke the words that had been practiced for years, each syllable a tightening rope. When the crown descended, the congregation saw the pageantry, a monarch anointed, a circlet placed. No one present saw the first small pierce of pain that began at the hairline, the sensation so subtle it might as well have been a whisper. The harm was quiet, and that quiet made it worse. As the days unfolded, the wearer misread the crown's interposition with the body. He believed the painful puncture to be a sign that the sacred object was working, a communion of flesh and relic. He took pain as proof of election and endured it as pious suffering. But the iron and the points of hardness did not merely prick skin. They did what iron does in a living place. They restrained, they rubbed, they invited rot in the small crevices where leather touched flesh. The head, pressed and contained beneath the circlet, became a furnace where infection could start and then slowly spread. Flesh, under the pressure of ritual weight, and the repeated heat of fever and sweat, softened and broke down. The wearer's vanity steered him into secrecy. He would not show the small fissures that began at the crown line, and so the wound was tended with rituals of concealment. He doubled the layers of linen and oil, wrapped the circlet with more leather, and lit more candles to hide the smell. Courtiers spoke about the monarch's devotion, the lengths he would go to prove sanctity, while a private chamber filled with the smell of putrefying flesh and candle smoke. The chronicler recorded details in pale ink, the way the king's hairline receded faster than that of his peers, the slow sinking of appetite, the nights of tremor that began beneath the candlelight. The high priest, who had stitched reverence and harm together, watched the outcome with a bifurcated sense of success. The crown bound the wearer to the church's design. He had become both symbol and controlled object. Yet the high priest's success was also a perverse experiment. He observed how conviction could convert into endurance, how a man could accept injury as sanctification. The crowning ritual had given the church a sovereign who would bear physical evidence of devotion, visible proof, borne silently upon his body, that would dissuade rivals and the doubtful. The smith lived with a different calculus. He had built a thing that both affirmed and destroyed. He returned to his forge at night, fingers pressed against the iron as if he sought absolution from the material itself. In the privacy of soot and spark, he rehearsed the strike of the hammer and wondered at the covenant he had helped to make. He had been practical and guilt-worn, remembering that survival sometimes asked a craftsman to make what others demanded. Yet each echo of metal had since become an indictment of his skill. He had made an object that promised legitimacy but delivered a slow cruelty. The wearer's body betrayed him with the slow patience of decay. At first there were fevers that flared and subsided, then nights of burning cold. Flesh near the crown's inner ring began to discolor, then to soften. The men who cared for the monarch at night were not practiced surgeons. They were servants who wiped and bandaged with awkward hands and whispered prayers that meant nothing to what lay beneath the leather. Attempts at cleansing were clumsy and brought new irritations. Cauterization was attempted once, in desperation, and left a circle of blackened skin. That failed intervention only hastened the spread of infection by opening channels for deeper rot. The chronicler recorded the changes with a relentlessness that read like indictment. He noted how the wearer held himself differently. The habitual touch to the crown became more frantic, a searching gesture for reassurance that would not come. He catalogued small losses: the monarch's diminished appetite, the odd slur in speech, the intervals of delirium in which fever made visions of saints dissolve into faces made of iron. The ledger filled with measured notations, dates, symptoms, the names of attendants. It was not sympathy that drove the chronicler, but duty to record. His methodical notes would later form the spine of history's judgment. Courtiers wrote their letters in ink that had a tendency to lie. To most, the wearer's troubles were explained as the weight of governance and an ascetic devotion to prayer. Rumors traveled the corridors like rats beneath floorboards, some suspected poisoning, others whispered divine punishment. The high priest used such murmurings as a tide, steering concern away from accusation of his own hand and toward a narrative that framed suffering as sanctity. The court embraced the narrative because it was useful. A king who bled for his people convinced rivals of his zeal and made dissent appear sacrilegious. Outside the cathedral's nave, the city continued with a different metric. Fields were sown and harvested with the indifferent rhythm of seasons. Men struck bargains, debts were tallied, and deaths occurred that had nothing to do with crowns or chronicles. But even here the iron circlet's influence spread. Men in power altered laws. Gifts were requested of those who feared the monarch's divine imprimatur, and the church's authority tightened like a noose around civic life. The crown was at once a private instrument of punishment and a public device of control. When the wearer could no longer conceal the unraveling of his health, he retreated to a private chamber where the light of candles could be controlled, and the high priest could minister in cautious rituals that doubled as examinations. The chamber, once a place of ceremonial repose, became an incubator. Damp linen, extinguished candles, cracked wax pooling like dark language across the sill. The smell of iron and rot grew robust and unignorable. Attendants moved with small steps and shorter breath. The chronicler's ink grew heavier as he recorded the monarch's decline, each entry read like a ledger of inevitable collapse. At the end, the wearer held on to belief with animal tenacity. He touched the circlet until his fingertips were raw. There was a superstitious stubbornness in thinking pain could be transformed into holiness. But iron is indifferent to intention. The crown's inner points that had been designed to secure obedience had become a lattice of injury, and the body could not be convinced that such faith would be rewarded. Flesh rotted beneath sanctified metal. Bone, left unsupported by the soft tissue that had once protected it, felt exposed to the metaphysical. The wearer's mind slid between memory and fever, and in the spaces between he understood, perhaps too late, how his vanity had been weaponized. The chronicler recorded the final days with a sterile clarity that resembled embalming by words. He did not dress the facts in pity. He left to time the duty of deciding what those facts would mean. In the aftermath, the crown was removed and placed in a chest where candles were set around it like a reverent firewall. And in doing so the court attempted a final act of control. They would hide the instrument whose function was both legitimacy and ruin. Yet hiding is itself an admission. The object that had once depicted sanctity, but inflicted harm, had to be made invisible because its visibility would undermine the very sanctity it had been meant to represent. The smith lived on. The high priest remained in power for a little longer, his hands folded over a rosary and his mouth shaping the same prayers that had once bound the monarch to the church's design. The chronicler's pages traveled beyond the court, folded into other records, and carried into the margins of history. The story entered lore as both warning and justification for the faithful. The wearer's suffering could be dressed as consecration. For the skeptical, it became a parable of how institutions might use sanctity to harm. The palace ministers rewarded power. The people moved forward. The cathedral's paint flaked, and the saint's hallows dulled further. What endures is the image, the crowned head, the circlet biting into flesh, the candlelight turning blood into a sacrament that no religion intended. The iron crown remained a complex thing, relic and instrument, symbol and wound. History would argue over intent and consequence. Future scribes would ask whether the high priest had intended murder or merely sought to cement power, whether the wearer's vanity had been the fatal flaw or the church's ambition the lethal design. Those questions have weight, and they would be discussed in learned halls. But there is a simpler, crueler truth beneath such debate. The fusion of faith and craft allowed a ritual to become a mechanism of slow death. When sanctity is used as method, it ceases to be a mercy. The cathedral kept its silence like an animal conserving heat. Candles would be lit again and again, their flames fragile against drafts in the vaulted space. Priests continued to pray and men continued to craft. The iron crown moved through hands, from chest to reliquary, from altarpiece to vault, and each transfer was a small absolution of guilt. Yet the object retained the memory of what it had done. Metal holds shape, and the shapes it created in flesh remained in recorded testimony, tullied lines in the chronicler's ledger that would not burn away with the wax. This record is not offered for pity. It is a cold account of the ways power, sanctity, and craft can be woven into instruments of control. It is a story of human choices that, when coupled with design, become policies of pain. The Iron Crown is a lesson in how rites can become weapons, and how the religious may cloak intentions in the language of devotion to maintain authority. It is a testament to a time when the architecture of belief could be recalibrated to ensure obedience, even at the slow cost of human flesh. The object itself is now legend, its edges blurred by centuries and by those who would prefer that the past be kinder. Yet the ledger remains the chronicler's entries, the smith's private misgivings, the high priest's measured lines, the wearer's ruined visage. Together they form a ledger of consequence and of design, a record that no amount of pious explanation can entirely erase. The crown taught a terrible lesson, one that echoes whenever sanctity and power are fused without consciency. Even a relic of faith can be made into an instrument of torment. And the scream of that transformation is recorded not just in sound, but in the patient disintegration of the body that bore it. Some histories call it a tragedy of faith, others reduce it to the mechanics of power. The truth is the quieter, more dreadful thing that endures in the ledger, when men and institutions choose ends over means. When craft is harnessed to an ambition that sacrifices bodies for symbols, the result is both technical and brutal. There is no sanctification in injury. There is only the knowledge that human design, when untethered from mercy, can turn a crown into an arresting device for the soul. In the cold hours before dawn, when the cathedral stones remembered the last prayers and the bell dust had not yet settled into the gutters, they carried the Iron Crown into a narrow chamber beneath the nave. The crown was older than the dynasty that coveted it had been beaten and bent across generations until iron and myth braided into a single fetish. Men spoke of relic and rite, of heaven's sanction hammered into metal. The house of the wearer had come to believe that the circlet fixed to the brow could press the will of God through a man's skull and into the bones of a realm. The chronicler would later write in patient script that faith and craft met on that anvil and did not part. The smith's hammer sang a steady, unromantic rhythm, strike, cool, strike, a ritual of red-orange steel and sweating backs. The high priest attended the work as one attends a sacrament, white cassock smudged with soot, rosary clutched like a tool. He called no benediction the smith could hear. His prayer was the slow counting of hearts he could bend. The smith struck with a hand that remembered bread and cold hearths, but not the way his iron would come to rest against living flesh. The wearer watched his men haul the finished circlet into the light of the chapel with the same detached hunger a commander reserves for a new instrument of power. In the beginning there was ceremony, incense, slow knelt bodies, the high altar a stage of shadow and gold. The crown was placed with deliberate cruelty. It was not the fit of a jeweller's object, but the imposition of a verdict. Leather lined the circlet for comfort where the iron met skin, but the leather was laced and studded, threaded through with thin rivets and short metal bayons meant to bite into the scalp when the brow tensed beneath the weight of responsibility. The high priest invoked the lineage, the relics, the sins of those who had not bent their necks to the church. He made public the doctrine that the crown's pressure was a sign, an earthly translation of heavenly scrutiny. A king who could be in pain and still not cry before God, he preached, would be a king fit to lead the faithful. The wearer was a man of pious vanity. He believed in the mnemonic power of ceremony. The crown would seal his legitimacy, anoint him with the authority to command, to confiscate, to punish. He believed he could accept the crown's discomfort because all men suffer for their station. Yet the circlet did not settle, it insinuated. In the weeks after the coronation, the wearer learned the crown had been honned with more than symbolism. Where it pressed, hair thinned and broke. Fine wounds, small at first, like needle marks beneath a circlet's rim, refused to heal as simple cautery could not staunch the corrosion that crept from iron into flesh. Pain arrived in a tempered way, It was not a single agonizing moment, but a constellation of small betrayals. He found in the solitude of the night that the crown's leather straps had been tightened in a way that ensured movement of jaw, and neck tugged the iron against the scalp. A slight fever visited that first month, a damp, private malady. The royal physicians gave herbal names to, while the high priest suggested prayer as remedy. Healing remedies failed, flesh grew tender, and then raw scab and salt replaced hair. Courtiers pretended ignorance. To approach the subject publicly was to accuse the church of heresy. To accuse the priest was to court excommunication. Suffering became a palimpsest, private, ritualized, and strategically silenced. The wearer altered. Vanity remained in his clothes. In the way he arranged his mantle, it was only the shape of his cruelty that shifted. He began to use pain as a public instrument, to brand his own endurance into law. A man who could be seen suffering and remain in control was made into a spectacle of inevitability. He would sit during public audiences with the crown a visible cause of mild discomfort, and when challengers spoke in insolence, they heard of divine accusations instead of political grievances. The crown's presence converted physical pain into moral proof. What was once a private wound became a mechanism for governance. The more the wearer bared his suffering, the more the priests declared it sacred test. The more his acts of brutality looked like divine ordination. Between the forging and the next winter, other hands altered the circlet. The high priest cultivated secrets no ledger might list. The crown was not a single object, but a composite of rites and additions. He had persuaded, coursed, and in limited cases purchased the smith's increments of devotion. The smith, who had once known hunger and had a better hope for bread now, learned to make adjustments that made the crown more honest in its work. Nails were threaded more finely, internal spikes were sharpened so as not to split skin suddenly, but to aggravate it continuously. The additions were subtle filaments that worn hair would catch, thin plates that chafed at bone during sleep, but the outcome was cumulative, a slow, localized decay. Chroniclers recorded things the court denied. The chronicler watched and wrote with a hand that trembled at nothing and at everything. His ledger carried both the patience of the monastery and the honesty of an archivist who does not suppose mercy can be painted into script. He described the wearer's afternoons in council, how the king would listen, jaw clenched, fingers to his forehead, the crown a dark hallow, then sign decrees with a calm, mechanical stroke. He wrote without flourish how thieves were made examples of, how prisoners found their nails separated one by one to teach industriousness, and were then sent to the salt mines without word to kin. The chronicler's entries carried the worldliest of calculations. They recorded the sequence of power, the transactions of fear, the way mechanisms of authority were justified by ritual pain. He wrote that the high priest called these punishments purifying, an idea that made weight and policy indistinguishable. Not all who served saw themselves as instruments. The smith bore a much younger man's humility and an older man's scars. He had learned first to shape plowshares and then to answer the demands of patrons with voices that never lowered to ask after a man's soul. The smith's hands knew the geometry of stress and the language of metal. When he hammered, he read how a curve would settle. When he annealed, he could tell where a rivet would take the strain. He thought himself a builder of objects, not of injury. Guilt came in increments, a late-night memory of the wearer's brow with hair matted to gore, a child's finger pinched by a ritual buckle, a courtesan's collapse in the stairwell where she had begged to see mercy and was instead told she must pay the price of spectacle. The smith swore to the ledger he kept in the dark that his craft had been meant to hold a symbol aloft, not to press open a grave. The kingdom's winters were the slow work of the crown. Flesh became a map of neglect and design, obsessed nodules where iron had bitten. Physicians were summoned who practiced with both herb and blady. They probed and dressed, but the infection returned as a predictable tenant. Merciful amputations were proposed: hairline excisions, small flaps of skin removed and cauterized, but the crown's design ensured any intervention was only an intermission. The high priest forbade drastic remedies, citing sacrament. He insisted patience. He insisted that suffering was testimony, that healing would dishonor the rite by making the test irrelevant. He argued, and the wearer listened, that the crown's indwelling sorrow was a sacrament the state could not abjure. The priest's voice, honeyed and cold, made every medical failure into a moral lesson. Political rivals took note. A monarchy dependent on staged sanctity depends simultaneously on silence. When the wearer punished, he did it with a learned detachment. Laws were framed in theological language. Confiscations were ordained as penance for the greedy. Trials became sermons. A man might be accused of fomenting unrest and be found guilty by the same council that profited from his fall. A visible king in pain made the machinery of power appear both righteous and inevitable. Opponents who would have argued policy instead found themselves arguing providence. The wear and rot around the crown operated as both shield and scythe. It fended off dissent and trimmed those who remained too strong. Yet rot does not respect political calculus. The wearer retreated from public exhibition at times. He was less the visible martyr and more the private prisoner of an iron circlet. Nights were the worst, when the candles burned low and the servants slept in corridors like a fold of shadows. The wearer's fever rose, and the crown's bite became literal. He would wake to find hair matted with blood, and the skin beneath glistening with moisture that was not sweat alone. The crown, in those hours, was a physical language that spoke of margin and loss, the scalp where a spike had gradually worked beneath the skin, the little crust of salt where a wound had seeped and dried like an insect trail. He considered removal and found the high priest already at his bedside, whispering reasons to abide. The priest believed in the crown's problem-solving power. The priest believed the crown's pain separated the chosen from the common. The wearer listened and sometimes obeyed. The chronicler later described clandestine councils, men with ledger and looped rope, ogling documents with the cadaverous attention of clerks who have long ceased to be surprised. They debated whether a king in pain was more effective than one who simply wielded power. Some argued that the crown had become a tool that maintained stability through spectacle. Tie suffering to authority, and the people would not distinguish governance from miracle. Others argued the crown had become a sickness within the polity, a metastasis the priests had fostered for leverage. The high priest argued that the crown was an instrument of unity. His words moved like cold oil. They lubricated decisions but not conscience. When the wearer's hair stopped hiding the crown's scars, the court began to look like an assembly of men who preferred the shape of their advantages to their moral reflections. They performed purges with the ease of men ordering bread, a name crossed, a house diminished, a ledger entry signed. Pain justified everything. The high priest's power grew with each ceremonial endorsement of suffering. He controlled the narrative: pain as proof, pain as sacrament, pain as proof of favor. The wearer, who once sought divine right, had become less a possessor of sanctity than a proof of it. In the end, the system consumed its node. The wearer's body refused the containment of ritual. Flesh infected past the margin any priest could sanctify. Infection moved into the skull, and the head ached with a malodorous insistence no candle could mask. Physicians, finally permitted to act without clerical restraint, opened and cut, sought to excise necrotic flesh. They failed in quantities their hands had never expected. A king who had once legislated the endurance of others now could not keep his own life from unfastening. He wasted into bedclothes while the high priest invoked last rites and ledger men argued succession. The chronicler wrote the list of those who stood to gain, prefacing each name with the cold calculus of advantage rather than lament. The smith recorded in his private copy the shape of the last circlet he had forged, and the way his hand did not tremble when he drew the line that condemned him in history. When the wearer died, the court processed the body with ritual neatness. They called it martyrdom, they called it providence. The high priest arranged a funeral in which damp candles burned like small accusations. The crown was removed and examined in the dim light. Its iron was etched with small notches where additions had been welded. Its inner leather bore the staining of long seasons of neglect, and care-hit spikes were polished to a cruelty of purpose. Some of the councilmen insisted on burial with honors. Others insisted that the circlet be buried separately, that its presence in a king's grave was too dangerous a relic for future temptations. They quarreled like men dividing coins. The chronicler closed his ledger with a line he did not expect to be read as history rather than as reproach. He wrote without flourish the final administrative acts and the property transfers, the executions, the quiet confessions given by men who had been part of the machinery. He wrote of the smith's name, never to be uttered in public. He wrote of the high priest's final sermon and the way his voice did not quite reach those now bent on removing him. The smith left the city before anyone could arrest him in the name of retribution or repentance. He carried with him the weight of metal and the idea that a maker's hand once shaped more than a toolet had shaped a mode of governance. In the ruined cathedral where the throne had once gleamed, the iron crown lay impaled upon stakes in a private yard, surrounded by extinguished candles and blunt iron spikes. They placed it there not in tribute, but in the mechanical way a gardener prunes diseased vines. The kingdom moved on, and empires often do. A new ruler crowned without spectacle or priestly augmentation tried, briefly, a different path. Yet the memory of the crown's work lingered in bone and custom. Men still favored visible suffering as evidence of moral standing. The mechanism had been internalized. Rituals do not die with a monarch. They become habit scripts to be performed on new stages. The reduction of a reign to a set of mechanisms is what the chronicler captured with his ledger's patience. He did not offer moral fireworks. He recorded that power can be made to appear sacred by aligning pain with proof. He recorded how the very rites meant to bind a ruler to higher things had been turned into instruments of social engineering. How metal and motive together could make cruelty look like providence. The wearer sought legitimacy and received a slow corrosion. The smith sought craft and received guilt. The priest sought control and received a liturgy of leverage. The artifact, the ritual, the ledger, the crown, the ceremony. The record remained to teach a lesson the republicans and philosophers would later recount in cooler terms. Empires built on suffering will rot from within. Centuries pass, but the pain lingers. That is the recorded end, and the only kind of closure a ledger allows, not catharsis, but a damp, rigorous accounting of what men made when they mixed faith and force. The Iron Crown went on to sit in the realm's memory like a dark icon, a reminder that an object can transmute into a method, and a method can transmute into a habit of governance. The wearer's face, as painted in candlelit portraits, retains the sallow, steely look of a man who had believed a circlet could alter the soul. The chronicler's pages, preserved in a monastery's damp archive, list names without epithet and leave the reader to taste the remainder and aftertaste of ash and iron. What remains is not a single moral to clutch, but a pattern to recognize how institutions can weaponize the body's vulnerabilities into certifying tokens. How craftsmanship can be enlisted into cruelty, how piety spoken with a honeyed rasp can turn suffering into a public virtue. The Iron Crown's history shows a rule in which the line between sanctity and torment is not sharp but conveniently blurred. The story, coldly recorded, persists as a caution for any who would bind authority to spectacle. It is a ledger entry and a warning. Behind the crown was hidden cruelty, and cruelty, once institutionalized, will outlive the men who first bent their wills to it. The Iron Crown had begun as a relic, a circlet of worked metal and myth that sat with impossible gravity in the imagination of a kingdom. In the first telling, it was an article of faith hammered iron, said to be tempered with the same or that once pierced the diviner link between heaven's ordination and earthly rule. By the third account, recorded in a ledger that smelled of damp ink and old stone, the iron crown was not merely emblematic of divine sanction. It was an instrument that gave shape to fear, a doctrine that punished as much as it promised salvation. In this chapter, the burden of the crown no longer feels like an abstraction. The wearer, a man whose face had been weathered by candle wax and cold stone, whose jaw had learned to hold a posture of endurance, learned what the office demanded in ways that were bodily and irreversible. Where once inverted theology had offered reassurance, the notion that suffering could be a conduit for sanctified authority, the crown became a mechanical sermon, its metal edge translating sanctity into slow erosion. The chronicler, ever deliberate, traced the abrasion of flesh and the corrosion of conscience with a hand that would not be quieted. The high priest, whose hands smelled of old incense and commerce, watched the crown's work as if it were both sacrament and tool. The smith, grim and wide-shouldered, saw his craft assume a new name in the mouths of men's instrument. Vanity had met austere ritual, and the alchemy was not purity. Vanity, gilded by prayers and the patter of clerical authority, allowed a man to endure discomfort in the name of heavenly right. But that endurance had limits. The crown's iron, lined within by strips of leather and threaded with minute spikes intended to hold relics and anchor the circlet, rode those limits like a tide. At first there were only promises of pain, as proof to be crowned was to accept the burden, and thus the pain that authenticated divine favor. A procession, a hymn, a moment of public agony that proved worthiness. The spectacle consoled both sovereign and subjects who needed to believe their office transcended mortal failing. The chronicler wrote in a cold script the sequence by which devotion curdled into cruelty. He recorded the first indentations along the wearer's scalp in the ledger with the same impartiality he used for weather and levy faint impressions, blistering beneath clothes, and then ulceration. At the outset, the high priest prescribed longer hours of sitting with the circlet, a ritual of perseverance that would harden the soul. The wearer obliged more by necessity than by zeal, believing that to falter would be to flinch from the mandate of heaven. The court applauded. The people murmured. The smith, who had hammered the circlet into existence, watched the metal take on an agency he did not intend. Hospitals in the 9th century were not places of gentle care, and the line between medicine and superstition was thin and charged. The ledger records the scent of bandaged linen and the sharp, bitter presence of herbal brew. When the wearer sought relief, the same authorities who had urged the suffering bound it into ritual. Linen was soaked in herbal poultices and laid against weeping flesh, then drawn back to expose infection that would not be borne silently. The church advice was always to treat the body only insofar as it allowed the man to continue bearing the sign of officer, emphasize penance and the transmutation of pain into sanctity. The high priest's counsel was precise, mercilessly elegant. If sanctity required blood, then blood would consecrate the crown rather than dissolve it. The chronicled entries form a ledger of erosion. Where once the circlet sat proud and untroubled, its rim began leaving crescent moons of injury. The leather lining dark with sweat, and candle tallow hardened into something abrasive. The spikes, intended as anchoring points, worked like small sieves through which living tissue was drawn and held. The wearer adopted a ritual of feigned indifference. He picked at his nails with the same obsessive motion recorded earlier, half smiling at his reflection, and pressed his palm to the circlet as if for anchorage. In private, the pain made his voice thin and brittle. In public, he kept the merciless calm of a man who could not show fracture. The high priest's role grew subtler and more corrosive. He did not merely approve the crown, he reframed its harm as sacrament. Sermons that had once spoken in proverb and parable now spoke in imperative wounds, endured under holy sign, would absolve not only personal doubt, but the sins of a realm. Nobles listened closely. The church's position hardened into strategy. A king who suffered as the symbol of office demonstrated dependence upon ecclesiastical mediation. Authority shifted in consequence. The crown's physical damage had become political leverage. It was in a damp-fingered smithy, tucked beneath vaulted stone, that the smith, hammer in hand and heart in his throat, confronted the geometry of his responsibility. The iron he had folded and filed was no longer a mere circlet of office, but an apparatus. He found himself smoothing edges with a degree of care that felt like repentance. Yet he also adapted the crown to the expectations of its patrons, an inner ridge to keep it centered, microscopic protrusions to hold relics claimed to sanctify the pain, and a lining designed to trap the sweat and warmth of the scalp, a cradle for infection if left too long. He learned, with a maker's stubbornness, to call the circlet by the same names they called the kingdom: necessary, sovereign, obedient to law. The political calculus was relentless. Where kings had once secured loyalty with grants of land and displays of largesse, the crown introduced a threshold test. Those who questioned the monarch's divine favor now faced not only exile or execution, but the spectacle of the monarch's own suffering as moral reproof. To speak of the crown's cruelty was to risk being branded impious. The wearer's court became a theater where suffering authored obedience. The nobles came to play their parts. They would bend, they would present salves, they would nod at sermons and sign oaths by torchlight. And they would trade the quiet intimacies of influence for the loud proof of sanctity bleeding on a sovereign's brow. In the chronicler's ledger, a recurring motif appears: containment. Hospital chamber, cathedral crypt, council hall, each consecrated space was constructed so the body's deterioration could be witnessed and contained at once. Candles pooled wax on stone ledges, their light carved the world into chiaroscuro, where faces became masks of clay and guilt. The wearer moved from ceremony to seclusion, his public physiognomy overlaying a private map of lesions and festering wounds. He clutched at the iron circlet in moments of dread, not as a symbol of power, but as a talisman against the more terrible infliction of being exposed as merely mortal. As infection widened its claim, the nervous system betrayed the wearer in new ways. Sleep came clipped by nightmares. He started at the scrape of leather and the whisper of a rosary bead. Appetite failed. Food sat like a stone in a throat raw from fever. The steady hand that once signed edicts trembled. Courtiers whispered of a monarch who could not master his temper, yet the root of the change was physical and clinical. The crown, by constant pressure and the retention of moisture and heat, had introduced a slow necrosis. Flesh softened around the rim. Hair fell in places as if shaved by an unseen blade. The chronicler recorded these transformations as if taking notes in a ledger of weather objective and relentless. The high priest's sermons reacted not with compassion but with interpretive ferocity. Pain he preached from the raised chancel, voice iron soft, is the refinement. The fire that burns the dross from gold. The marks upon our sovereign are not blemishes but badges. They show this court that heaven exacts for its mysteries. He used scripture like a whetstone. The church argued that the crown's visible damage bore witness to the king's inward sanctity, an argument that shifted culpability from institution to individual. The wearer believed it, or he allowed himself to, because belief protected him from the mortifying alternative that he had been chosen by no higher will, that he had been elevated by human machinery and animal hunger for power. Those closest to the monarch altered their behavior accordingly. Wives and lovers, when present, learned to avoid touching the circumference of his head. Their palms hovered over his shoulder or smoothed a sleeve in lieu of a caress. Children saw a father who returned from councils with a pallor they could not name. Nobles came bearing gifts of salves and ointments, concoctions brewed by apothecaries and novices who blended plant lore with crude empiricism. But these offerings were more political than medicinal. Each salve carried a price, a land grant here, an oath of fealty there. In this calculus, the wearer understood his body's decline as both a personal failing and a commodity. There were episodes of dissent. A court physician, a man trained under more practical tutors than clerics, once pleaded for the circlet to be loosened, to allow time for healing unmediated by the priesthood. He spoke with the bluntness of someone who had seen gangrene start like a small, private sea. "If we remove the pressure," he said in a council chamber where tapers guttered, "and cleans the sores, the man may yet recover the faculties the realm requires." The high priest declared such counsel heresy. "To loosen the circlet," he replied, voice low and cultivated, "is to loosen the tie between heaven and kingdom. Better a bleeding crown than a throne unmoored." Political maneuvering crushed the dissent. The physician withdrew into obscurity. Others followed with a caution that served survival. The smith, present in the periphery of courtly life, found himself asked to produce variants, lighter circlets for friendly ceremonies. Heavier weights for coronations intended to leave marks visible to the faithful. His conscience narrowed into a tolerance of tasks expected by men who saw metal as language. He came to the cathedral doors with tools in the night and lingered in corners, where he listened to the murmured plans of clerics and nobles who argued over small adjustments as though they were theology. He began to calculate not only the temper of iron but the temper of men. The narrative returns again and again to a particular council night registered, with clinical cruelty in the ledger. The wearer, pale and unsteady, presided over a tribunal while blood that had begun behind his ear found new channels to the skin. He listened, and he pronounced judgment with a voice that stayed rough at the edges. The chronicler observed that the shedding of blood under a sainted sign made judgment seem sacrosanct, as if suffering lent clarity. The edicts read from that chamber carried an aura that stilled dissent. Yet those judgments were thinner with the passage of time, laced with paranoia and a hunger to secure loyalty, not by governance but by the terror of public pain. A crucial turning point emerges when the wearer's body, long subject to ritualistic constraint, began to fail in ways the scripts had not predicted. Where once the crown would leave marks and the wound would be touched and tended, now a systemic decline unfolded. Fever came, high and untreatable by the crude medicines at hand. Limbs cooled in the night. The chronicler's hand went steadier as he recorded the precise progression: delirium, withdrawal, a muttering that was not prayer. The high priest bolstered his sermons with intensified rhetoric that cast the monarch's diminishing faculties as a holy test, one which in turn demanded more circlet hours to demonstrate unwavering fortitude. The effect on the court was gravitational. Care that should have been given to borders and harvests was absorbed into the minor ministrations of a sickbed. The wear of the king drew resources and attention inward. Political machinations replaced governance. Intrigues brewed as factions sought leverage over a man whose authority was inseparable from his suffering. Some noble houses petitioned that the crown be passed, citing the king's incapacity. Others argued that the crown's very trials authenticated his right, and that to remove it would unmake the sacred order. The wearer's body had become a battleground for succession. Petitions and counter-petitions crossed the chancery like small, sharp beasts. Alliances were bought with promises made in the hush of corridors, where wax dripped into puddles like blood. In a dark cell beneath the cathedral, where the smith sometimes slept, and where the chronicler sometimes paused to gather ink in a quiet hour, the mechanics of ritual were discussed like a trade. The spike points that had been engineered to keep relics, scraps of cloth, fragments of bone, consecrated threat wholly now were known for what they did, they held, and they corroded. The smith confessed, once, to a softening of steel edges in secret, a small subversion intended to reduce injury while preserving the idea of pain. He filed down a barb, rounded an angle, and wrapped the inner band with an extra strip of leather that would, for a few hours, ease the worst abrasion. Whether that modest act prolonged the monarch's endurance or forestalled worse outcomes is difficult to determine. The ledger does not judge, it merely notes. The wearer grew smaller in the record, his gestures were fewer, his smiles rarer. The crown altered not only his flesh but his language. Metaphors turned toward restraint, toward holding, toward binding. He spoke in the chronicler's account of the kingdom as a body that must not be slackened, of faith as a wire to be kept taut. He used phrases that reeked of cordage and tension. The priests nodded, the nobles aligned, and the people who had once cheered at pageants and at the lifting of banners watched with a mixture of awe and a secret, animal unease. Pageantry continued as ritual theatre, banners, trumpets, and the ritual of presenting salves and prayers at the base of a throne cut by infection. The chronicler set down the small domestic cruelties as much as the grand pronouncements. A daughter forbidden to braid a father's hair because of the circlet's circumference. A morning when the queen turned away from a mirror rather than witness the slow unmaking of a husband's face. A valet who learned to hold the basin with a hand that would not linger. These human details accumulate in the ledger like dust on a shelf. Their accumulation changes the shape of the room. The chapter ends not with a single climactic rupture but with an erosion, small betrayals, incremental consolidations. The Iron Crown had made of governance an ethics of endurance, and of endurance a mechanism for domination. Wounds wide-kneed authorities reinterpreted cruelty as sanctity. A craftsman adjusted his steel to survive a conscience split by necessity. The wearer carried the physical evidence of this exchange on his head, and in his brow a mark of office, a map of corruption, a wound that testified to an idea. The chronicler closed the chapter with the same cold hand that had opened it, recording the facts with the implacable curiosity of one who understands that to name a wound is to deny the comfort of myth. If faith provided a language for suffering, then by the end of this chapter the language itself had been co-opted. Pain no longer functioned as private expiation but as public policy. The crown's iron will had become a mechanism to rewrite obligations, personal suffering authorized institutional power. There is a singular cruelty in that conversion, the conversion of a relic into a regime. The wearer's end in this chapter is not the dramatized fall of legend. It is a slow narrowing of possibility. He does not die here in a single stroke. He learns instead the intimate geography of living under a crown that will not be shared. He becomes at once saint and symptom. The chronicler notes how the man's hands grew thinner, how he started to hum hymns under his breath as if to anchor himself, how he kept one folded rosary in his desk and another burning in his palm at night as a talisman both of office and of torment. And the kingdom that reveres him recalibrates its moral terms, sanctity measured by wound, authority preserved by endurance, and cruelty rendered holy by its invocation of the divine. The chronicler notes this with detached patience. The high priest continues to clasp a rosary that smells faintly of iron. The smith returns to his anvil and the hammer falls as if in time to an internal clock that marks the passing of conscience. Even the cathedral bells change pitch a little in the ledger's later entries, tolling not for a death and not yet for a coronation, but for the everyday liturgy of a realm that had learned to trust the marks of a wound more than the voice of governance. This chapter is a ledger of tightening of the crown, of the throat of a realm, and of the reasons men and institutions bend toward cruelty when it can be called sacred. It is also an anatomical study of how a physical object reshapes social order, how metal and leather and ritual together form a science of domination. The record is not content to moralize it, it insists on particulars. It demands the reader's attention to the small mechanics by which suffering becomes governance. In that attention there is no solace, only the slow, unavoidable knowledge that relics can be refashioned into instruments, and that sanctity, in the hands of the calculating, can. The Iron Crown was not made for glory. It began as a circlet hammered from the memory of conquest, an object of metal and vow intended to bind a king to a promissory. By the time of this chapter, its purpose had been transmuted into something harsher, an apparatus that bent faith into mechanics of power. The wearer took it as men take absolution, because he believed that the crown would answer a question older than his own hunger. Who among men could claim the voice of God? But the answer it gave was always the same: the crown demanded payment. A chronicler who kept a ledger of the court's liturgies and failures recorded the sequence in meticulous strokes, as if precision could arrest meaning. He watched how ritual and craft came together to make suffering legible, and how piety could be worked into coercion. When the high priest declared the circlet sacred, and the smith forged it to a new severity, the process read like a covenant written in iron. The smith, who learned to listen to the grain of metal the way others listened for sermon, hammered the circlet thin and cruel. Threading small ridges and secret barbs beneath the leather lining features the high priest insisted were relic-like, a binding to saintly memory. The wearer's attendants called the new touches craftsmanship, the sick called them instruments. In candlelight the crown took on a face of its own. It had a weight beyond mere ounces, the weight of lineage, of expectation, and of those innumerable prayers which had been bent into entitlement. The wearer, mid-40s and stocky, carried himself with a brittle piety that had grown from the same loam as vanity. The chronicler noted how his eyes, steely and hooded, flicked toward mirrors and reliquaries as any man might toward counsel. Hands that had once signed farm grants and pardons now trembled over heraldic seals. The high priest moved among them, a gaunt man with pale blue eyes and the practiced posture of one who could make silence enforce doctrine. He described the crown in the language of relic. This is the iron of martyrdom. This is the proof that God chooses. The truth he shaped lay in a tone and a slow smile, a theology that bound obedience to ritualized pain. The smith did not speak of piety. He spoke of edges and temper and heat. He spoke of the way iron could remember the touch of a hammer if held long enough, of how a circlet once cooled would hold a particular pressure. He was a practical man, suit darkened and collused, with a burn scar across his cheek. When he fitted the leather and iron together, he tested for pressure, for the tiniest variance that would pin hair and press on skin. He told himself, in the dark between bell strikes, that a crown was meant to be tight, symbolic of the weight of office. He did not say that some of his tests had left shallow wounds, that some wearers had complained of a soreness that would not ease. He only smoothed the lining, tied the cord, and handed the object back to a church that knew the vocabulary of binding. Those who watched most closely were not the courtiers waving banners, but the silent things that inhabit a cathedral at night: the cold stone, the breath fogging in the nave, the tiny rivers of wax draining down candle stands. The chronicler catalogued these details because they offered purchase on a morality the court refused to articulate. He wrote in margins about the smell of iron and smoke, and the way the wearer's breath altered short, distracted, as if prayer and pain were now the same rhythm. He noted a pattern: each king who took the circlet carried it home in triumph and returned to their bedchamber with fever. The court physicians blamed bad humors or the strain of rule. Those who walked like the high priest in the corridors said that martyrdom left no one untouched. The chronicler understood how language could both conceal and reveal. He kept both readings side by side. Ritual gave the crown a logic. The high priest staged the investiture as a sacrament, incense thick in the vaults, a choir of a dozen voices humming against the stone, candles arranged in a closed geometry. The wearer knelt as the circlet was brought forward, touched the leather as if it were scripture, and the high priest pronounced words from an old liturgy. The people of the court, trained to speak of suffering as proof of sanctity, nodded. In those moments, cruelty clothed itself in tradition. The crown's barbs were made to look like relic wear, as if the holes left by pressure were marks of grace. Pain at first was an equalizer. It drew the wearer closer to the bodies and stories of saints, whose icons the church displayed figures who had borne wounds for a higher purpose. But when pain bred isolation, it ceased to be a symbol and became a strategy. The crown did not cut in an eruptive, dramatic way, and instead it pressed and lingered. In the privacy of the chamber, the wearer would lift the circlet, his hands smelling of candle smoke and iron, rub the rim where it pinched skin, and put it back as if confirming a contract. That repeated return was where deterioration took root. Soreness turned to fever, fever to delirium, and delirium to a mind that learned to conflate devotion with endurance. Each wear shrank the world to the radial ring of pain around his head. Within the court, the high priest's role shifted from interpreter of scripture to architect of consent. He taught doctrine in measured, honeyed tonus. Sovereignty was a vocation of suffering, to sustain doubt was sin. Because he could smooth meaning across doctrine, he made the circlet an instrument of governance, as much as a symbol of divine favor. Men who opposed the wearer were accused of sacrilege. Those who argued for mercy were told they undermined heaven's choice. In this way, cruelty attained institutionality. The chain of command fed on the crown's secrecy, the fact that the lining was altered so delicately that only the crown's intimate wearer would feel the true design, helped the high priest maintain power. What he could call sanctified, the rest could only fear. The wearer's inward life changed. He began to think of his body as a ledger of the throne's cost. He polished the signet ring worn on his right hand, and then held it up to the candle, watching the flame make his eyes small and feral. He developed small rituals to reassure himself, the half-smile that never reached his eyes, the habitual picking at a fingernail, the way he would touch the crown as if to reassure it rather than himself. His manners hardened into avoidancy. He preferred quick counsels and short audiences, because fewer voices meant fewer chances for the crown's toll to be observed. He grew fragile to counsel and vicious to suspicion. A man who feared the crown could not be weak before it. A weakness invited replacement. So he learned the logic of preemption, to silence doubt before it could grow. Silence and complicity conspired to make the court smaller and sharper. Courtiers learned the calculus of survival, attend the high priest's prayers, speak the right names. Do not linger in corridors where the smith's apprentices still hummed as if nothing had happened. The smith, for his part, kept his eyes down. He would be paid and praised and later forgotten. He carried guilt like a tool around his waist. It was heavy but necessary. He told himself, and anyone who would listen, that craftsmanship was beyond moralizing. He shaped iron for a world that had always used force to fix things. His hands remembered only the work. Sometimes the crown's toll became public in softened ways that the court could stage and then domesticate. A procession would be announced when a king fell ill. The high priest's homilies would interpret the sickness as a sign of suffering for the realm. Mourning rites, carefully controlled, would enfold the failing into a narrative where pain equaled sanctity. The chronicler resisted this smoothing. His ledger kept not only dates but the small resistances, a physician's note about restlessness, a maid's observation of tremor, the quiet of a night in which the wearer wandered the bedchamber whispering to himself. He put them beside each other, as if by adjacency he could let facts converse. It was not only the physical strain that unmade rulers. The crown bent mind as it bent flesh. The wearer would begin to read enemies into ordinary speech. He took small slights as conspiracies and replied with disproportionate measures. A man accused of whispering treason might find himself exiled, stripped of titles, or paid a visit in the night that left him changed. The high priest advised caution, but assured that divine order must be preserved. The legal language of the court shifted. Words of mercy were replaced by words of necessity. Even loyalty tasted of fear. The chronicler, who had vowed to preserve truth for posterity, committed his ledger to margins, to ink-stained pages that he hid beneath prayer books. He watched the wearer fracture into an economy of private rituals and public defenses. In the cathedral's shadows he recorded the small, human things that the state would prefer to forget, the wearer bathing alone and weeping without sound, the smith sleeping by his forge and waking with the memory of a hammer blow like a staccato in the skulls, the high priest adjusting his stole and practicing a smile that would read as compassion. The chronicler's obligation to fact made him humaner. To witness was to refuse the anesthetic of sanctioned narrative. Occasionally, a moment would break the cadence of slow harm and force the court to answer to itself. A wearer's fever might spike during an audience. He would faint and the room would orbit panic. The doctors would whisper of bad humors and remedies, poultices rubbed on temples, cool linens, a regimen of fasting and broth. The high priest would perform rites, and the choir would swell to a crescendo that made the stones ring. The court called such moments divine trial and rallied in affirmation. The chronicler called them what they had always been, a man being dissolved under the pressure of an apparatus made to secure him. Behind the scenes, in the smithy beneath the cathedral where metal cooled and sparks were like little falling stars, the smith sometimes tried to alter the crown. He would file a burr here, then a spike there, as if minor concessions could ease the pressure enough to keep the wearer from breaking. The high priest forbade such tinkering. Sanctity could not be compromised by sentiment. The smith acquiesced outwardly and resented inwardly. He carried a ledger of his own marks on handles, notations in the margin of temper and angle, private evidence of how a hand could temper cruelty even as it made it strong. Slowly, sullenly, the wearer passed through rites that once sanctified and became mechanisms that maintained the high priest's order. Kings came and gone, each crowned with iron, and each declining in the same tight arc. The pattern read like prophecy, expected, inexorable. The people told stories to explain their rulers' fretting and decline. Some said it was divine visitations, others blamed the complicated humor of age. The chronicler recorded both stories and refused to let storytelling obliterate detail. He believed that to keep the ledger was to keep accountability. He wrote not to indict, but to preserve the trace of how power could be engineered. This chapter is therefore not only about metal and bone. It is about the slow engineering of obedience, about how a religious vocabulary was repurposed into a series of rites that produced certain political outcomes. It is about how the high priest used sanctity as architecture, how the smith's hands, skilled and human, were turned into instruments of an abstract authority, how the wearer, already fragile from fear, accepted his own corrosion in the language of devotion. The chronicler remained a witness, and a witness a human ledger in the face of a state that preferred symbol. In the end, the crown did not kill with a sudden blow. It unmoored kings from themselves, turning governance into endurance, and then turning endurance into excuse. The last entries in the ledger for the wearer's season are small and tremulous, notes about fevered sleep, a shorthand about lost appetite, an observation that the court's voice was quieter, as if afraid to wake something sleeping and angry. The high priest said prayer, the smith tightened a screw, the physicians applied poultices. People crossed themselves and wondered whether a king might still be saved. The chronicler's final act in this chapter was simple and defiant. He closed the ledger, placed it beneath the icon of a minor saint, and wrote an index so that future hands might find the pages. He did not seek punishment for the high priest, nor absolution for the smith. He wanted only for the record to remain. In his closing note he wrote in careful, measured script that the iron circlet so praised for its connection to heaven had become a device whose purpose extended beyond symbolism into the mechanics of obedience. He named neither malice nor sanctity, but he argued that the two had braided until they were indistinguishable. The record was his offering and his indictment, and the crown remained an object on the shelf of power. Candlelight would still fall on it. At certain hours novices would be brought to view it as a relic. The high priest would keep its designs in the library's private folios. The wearer would pass into the category called former king, a phrase easier to place in a ledger than the phrase a man broken. The users of sanctity would persist. The crown's next wearer would come with the same desire for divine right. The pattern would be repeated because the apparatus that made it possible had not been dismantled. The chronicler's pages might remain, a small truth in the archive, waiting for a reader who would not let the ledger be washed away. Centuries later, voices would still speak of crowns and divine selection, of the legitimacy that an object could grant. But in the margins of some forgotten folio there would be the chronicler's ink, faint but persistent, and the memory of a smith's steady hand, of a high priest's long counting of gains, and of a wearer who learned to hold pain like proof. The Iron Crown's communion had been with power, not with heaven, and its sacrament had been the remaking of bodies into assurance. Time passes, institutions mutate, and the smell of candles fades. Yet the ledger remains to remind those with eyes to read that where sanctity is conflated with coercion, cruelty can find a sacred grammar and a steady hand to write it.